You are wearing something right now. You probably didn't think about it this morning. You just put it on. But the moment your ancient ancestors first wrapped something around their bodies, they crossed a threshold that no other animal on this planet has ever crossed. And the reason they did it has almost nothing to do with what you were taught. It wasn't the cold. Not at first. Here is what the evidence actually says. And it will change the way you look at every piece of clothing you own. For most of human history, your ancestors walked around without a single thread on their bodies. Homo erectus, roaming the African savanna 1.5 million years ago, was naked. And they were fine. The human body in a tropical climate doesn't need covering. Your skin sweats. It regulates. It handles heat and moderate cold better than you might think. So the question isn't why did humans eventually need clothes? The question is, why did they start wearing them before they needed to? Anthropologist Ian Gilligan spent years reconstructing the timeline of clothing from archaeological evidence. What he found contradicts almost every assumption. Clothing didn't begin as survival gear. It began as something far more human than that. It began as decoration. Before the first needle, before the first hide was sewn, your ancestors were already adorning themselves. Pierced shells, ochre body paint, feathers pressed against skin. The earliest known ornaments date back over 130,000 years, found in caves in Morocco. And those ornaments weren't practical. They served no thermal function whatsoever. They meant something, and that is the first key. Humans didn't start by covering themselves. They started by marking themselves, by saying, I am part of this group. I am different from that one. I have status. I have power. I have a role. Clothing, at its origin, was language. Think about what that means for a species that hadn't yet invented writing. You couldn't leave a record of who you were, but you could wear one. A string of shells around your neck told a story. The color of pigment on your skin declared allegiance. Your body became a signal. Biological anthropologist Nina Jablonski, whose research into human skin and its evolution has reshaped how scientists think about the naked ape, points out something striking. Humans lost most of their body hair between 1 and 2 million years ago, long before clothing appeared in the archaeological record. That hair loss wasn't a problem. It was an adaptation. It allowed your ancestors to run long distances in the heat without overheating. The sweat glands that replaced the fur were more efficient for a hunter-chaser on the open savanna. But losing that hair also did something else. It turned your body into a canvas. Other primates communicate status and mood through facial expressions, through vocalization. But humans, with their newly bare skin, could do something extraordinary. They could display. They could transform their surfaces intentionally. And the moment your ancestors realized that, something clicked. The body became a message. Now the climate does eventually enter the story. Around 100,000 years ago, climate in Africa began to fluctuate. Ice ages were pushing and pulling the planet's temperatures. And some groups of humans were moving north, into Europe, into regions where bare skin in winter was no longer just uncomfortable. It was lethal. This is where Ian Gilligan's reconstruction becomes fascinating. He argues that clothing evolved in two phases. First, simple wraps and hides used as occasional cold weather protection. Then, tailored fitted clothing, the kind that actually traps body heat efficiently, which came much later, around 30,000 to 40,000 years ago, coinciding with the most severe cold periods of the last ice age. But here is the counterintuitive part. The decorative use came first. And when cold weather utility arrived, it merged with the existing symbolic system. So from the very beginning, clothing was never purely functional and never purely decorative. It was always both at once. Your brain inherited that dual system. When you choose what to wear in the morning, you are running two calculations simultaneously. One is practical. Am I warm enough? Can I move? Is this appropriate for the weather? The other is deeply social. What will people think? What does this say about me? Who do I want to be today? You don't separate those two calculations because they were never separate to begin with. Now here is where it gets strange. Geneticist Mark Stoneking and his team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology used an unusual method to date when humans first started wearing clothing regularly. They studied lice. Body lice are different from head lice. Head lice live in hair and have lived there for millions of years. Body lice live in clothing. They evolved from head lice specifically to exploit the new habitat that clothing created. By tracking the genetic divergence between head lice and body lice, essentially asking when body lice first became a distinct population, Stoneking's team estimated that clothing became a regular, consistent human behavior somewhere between 70,000 and 170,000 years ago. Not a single cold snap, not one tribe's innovation that disappeared. A sustained, spreading, permanent behavior. Clothing had become part of what it meant to be human. And this is where the modern mirror comes in, because you are still doing exactly the same thing your ancestors did 100,000 years ago. The specific fabrics have changed. The dyes are synthetic now. The needles are machines. But the behavior, the impulse to cover, to adorn, to signal, to declare, is the same impulse that drove a person in a cave to press red ochre against their skin before facing the day. When you choose a color that matches your mood. When you put on something that makes you feel powerful before an important meeting. When you wear the jersey of your team, the uniform of your profession, the ring of your commitment. You are doing something ancient. You are using your body as a message. You are saying, I am part of this. I am not part of that. This is who I am. Every culture on Earth, without exception, wears clothing of some kind. Anthropologists have never found a single human society in any climate that does not decorate or cover the body in some intentional way. Even groups in equatorial regions where temperature would never demand it. Even populations that anthropologists once described as unclothed were in fact wearing ornaments, pigment, scarification, some form of bodily signal. The need to mark the body is not a fashion trend. It is a human universal, and it connects to something even deeper. Psychologist Mark Leary, whose work on self-presentation and social identity has influenced how behavioral scientists think about appearance, argues that the human need to manage how others perceive us is one of the most powerful motivators in all of human behavior. More powerful in many situations than hunger, than comfort, than pain. Your ancestors risked frostbite to keep wearing the decorations that marked their status. You have skipped meals to afford something that made you look a certain way. The specific form changes. The underlying drive does not. So why did humans start wearing clothes? Not because they were cold, not first, not primarily. They started wearing clothes because they were social, because they were communicating, because they had evolved a brain that was obsessed with how it appeared to other brains, and because the naked body, once the fur was gone, was the most available surface in the world for broadcasting that signal. The cold was just the reason the habit became permanent. You put something on this morning without thinking about it, but the impulse behind that action is 100,000 years old at least. You dressed yourself the same way your ancestors did, not just to be warm, but to be seen, to say something about who you are before you opened your mouth. And the moment your ancestors wrapped that first piece of hide around their bodies, they weren't just getting dressed, they were becoming human.